It's 1453, and you're standing on the walls of Constantinople, the greatest city in the world. For over 1,000 years, these walls have held back countless enemies. But today, something different fills the air. The thunder of massive cannons, some weighing over 18 tons, shakes the very foundations of history itself. A 21-year-old sultan named Mehmed is about to do what seemed impossible: capture the last remnant of the Roman Empire. But this isn't just the story of one conquest. This is the story of how a small tribe of Turkish nomads built one of history's greatest empires, an empire that would span 3 continents, last over 600 years, and shape the world we live in today. Welcome to the complete history of the Ottoman Empire, from its humble beginnings in a small corner of Anatolia to its dramatic collapse after World War I. This is a tale of brilliant sultans and palace intrigue, of massive territorial expansion and devastating defeats, of cultural flowering and eventual stagnation. So grab your coffee, or should I say your Turkish coffee, and let's dive into 6 centuries of empire. Our story begins not with palaces and grand armies, but with a dream. According to legend, a man named Osman had a vision, a great tree growing from his chest, its branches extending across 3 continents, its roots drinking from rivers and seas. When he woke, a wise man interpreted the dream. Osman's descendants would build a mighty empire. Whether you believe the legend or not, Osman was real. Around 1299, this Turkish tribal leader established a small beylik, think of it as a mini-state, in northwestern Anatolia. But here's what made Osman different from countless other tribal chiefs: timing and location. Imagine the Byzantine Empire as a once mighty oak tree, now hollow and rotting. The great empire that had ruled from Constantinople for over a millennium was crumbling. Meanwhile, the Seljuk Sultanate, which had dominated Anatolia, was fragmenting into dozens of small Turkish states. Osman positioned his people right on the frontier between Christian and Muslim worlds, the perfect place for an ambitious leader to grow. But the early Ottomans weren't just raiders or conquerors. They were incredibly smart about integration. Think of them as the ultimate startups of the medieval world. They attracted talent from everywhere: Byzantine administrators who knew how to run cities, Islamic scholars who provided legitimacy, Italian merchants who brought trade connections, even Christian knights seeking adventure and profit. Osman's son Orhan took this strategy to the next level. In 1326, he captured Bursa, making it the first real Ottoman capital. But more importantly, Orhan created the Janissary Corps, and this is where the story gets really interesting. Picture this: you're a Christian family in the Balkans. Ottoman recruiters arrive at your village and select your strongest, smartest sons. Sounds terrible, right? But here's the twist. These boys weren't being sold into slavery. They were being recruited into the elite of the empire. They'd receive the finest education, convert to Islam, and potentially rise to become generals, governors, even grand viziers. The most powerful man in the empire, after the Sultan himself, was often a Janissary who started as a Christian peasant boy. This system, called devshirme, sounds brutal to us today, but it was revolutionary for its time. It created a military and administrative class that owed everything to the Sultan, not to local nobles or tribal loyalties. It's like creating a government staffed entirely by people you've personally trained and promoted. Ultimate loyalty guaranteed. By 1354, the Ottomans had crossed into Europe, capturing Gallipoli. This wasn't just military expansion, it was strategic genius. Europe was richer than Anatolia, with better farmland and more cities to tax. Plus, European powers were constantly fighting each other. Perfect conditions for a well-organized outsider to expand. The real game changer came with Murad I. In 1389, he fought the Battle of Kosovo against a Serbian coalition. Both Murad and the Serbian leader died in the battle, but the Ottomans won. This victory didn't just expand Ottoman territory, it established them as the dominant power in the Balkans. But then came disaster. Murad's son Bayezid, nicknamed the Thunderbolt for his speed, seemed unstoppable. He besieged Constantinople itself and expanded deep into Europe. But in 1402, he met his match, Timur, also known as Tamerlane, the last great Mongol conqueror. The Battle of Ankara was a catastrophe for the Ottomans. Bayezid was captured, the army was destroyed, and the empire almost collapsed. For over a decade, Bayezid's sons fought a brutal civil war for control. It looked like the Ottoman story might end before it really began. But empires, like people, sometimes grow strongest after their greatest failures. From the ashes of civil war emerged Mehmed I, who spent his reign rebuilding what had been lost. But it was his grandson, Mehmed II, who would earn a place among history's greatest conquerors. Mehmed II became Sultan in 1451 at age 19. Imagine being a teenager and inheriting an empire with one glaring problem. Constantinople, the greatest city in the world, still sat unconquered in the middle of your territory like a thorn in your side. For 150 years, the Ottomans had controlled the land around Constantinople, but the city itself, protected by the greatest walls ever built, remained Byzantine. Most people would have been intimidated. Mehmed was inspired. Here's where the story gets almost unbelievable. Mehmed didn't just want to conquer Constantinople, he wanted to do it in style. He hired a Hungarian engineer named Orban to build the largest cannons ever constructed. One cannon was so massive, it required 60 oxen to move and could fire a 1,500-pound stone ball over a mile. The sound of these cannons firing could be heard 10 miles away. But Mehmed's real genius wasn't just firepower, it was logistics and psychology. He built a fortress called Rumeli Hisari in just 4 months, cutting off Constantinople's supply lines. When the Byzantines tried to block the Golden Horn with a massive chain, Mehmed literally moved his ships overland, rolling them up and over a hill on greased logs to outflank the defenders. Picture the scene on May 29, 1453. Constantine XI, the last Byzantine emperor, died fighting on the walls as Ottoman forces poured into the city. Mehmed, now forever known as the Conqueror, prayed in the Hagia Sophia, officially ending the Roman Empire after more than 2,000 years. But conquering Constantinople was just the beginning. Mehmed transformed it into Istanbul, the jewel of his empire. He repopulated the city with people from across his domains: Turks, Greeks, Armenians, Jews expelled from Spain, Italian merchants. Istanbul became what New York City is today, a cosmopolitan melting pot where talent from everywhere came to make their fortune. The conquest of Constantinople sent shockwaves across Europe and the Islamic world. The Ottomans weren't just another regional power anymore, they were a world empire, and they were just getting started. Under Bayezid II and Selim I, the empire expanded in all directions. Selim, called the Grim, and you'll soon see why, conquered the Mamluk Sultanate, adding Egypt, Syria, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina to the empire. Overnight, the Ottoman Sultan became the guardian of Islam's holiest sites and the protector of pilgrims from around the world. But the greatest of all Ottoman sultans was yet to come. Suleiman I, known in the West as the Magnificent and in Turkish as the Lawgiver, ruled for 46 years, from 1520 to 1566. Think of him as the Ottoman version of Louis XIV, Elizabeth I, and Napoleon rolled into one. Under Suleiman, the Ottoman Empire reached its zenith in territory, wealth, and cultural achievement. Suleiman's military campaigns read like a greatest hits of medieval conquest. He captured Belgrade, expelled the Knights of Rhodes from their island fortress, and most dramatically, besieged Vienna in 1529. Picture the panic in European capitals as Ottoman armies, led by their invincible Sultan, appeared at the gates of Habsburg Austria's most important city. Although Vienna held out, Suleiman's message was clear. Nowhere in Europe was safe from Ottoman power. The empire now stretched from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf, from the Crimean Peninsula to the borders of Morocco. At its peak, it controlled about 2 million square miles, larger than the Roman Empire at its height. But Suleiman wasn't just a conqueror. His court in Istanbul rivaled Versailles for magnificence. He was a patron of arts and architecture. The architect Mimar Sinan built mosques and bridges that still take your breath away today. Suleiman himself wrote poetry under the pen name Muhibi, meaning lover. The empire's administrative system was also reaching perfection. The Ottoman system was like a well-oiled machine. Provinces governed by appointed officials, a complex tax system that funded massive armies and public works, and trade networks that connected Europe, Asia, and Africa. Venice and Genoa might have controlled Mediterranean trade once upon a time, but now all roads led to Istanbul.
By the late 16th century, the Ottoman Empire had become something unprecedented in history, a truly intercontinental empire that successfully integrated vastly different peoples, religions, and cultures. But what made this golden age so remarkable wasn't just its size, it was how it worked. Imagine you're a merchant in 1580. You could travel from Budapest to Baghdad, from Cairo to Crimea, all within a single empire, with standardized currency, consistent laws, and protection for trade. The Ottoman Empire was like an early version of the European Union, but covering 3 continents and lasting for centuries. The key to Ottoman success was something called the millet system. Instead of forcing everyone to become Turkish Muslims, the Ottomans allowed different religious communities to govern their own internal affairs. Orthodox Christians had their own courts and laws, as did Armenians, Jews, and other groups. It was like having multiple operating systems running on the same computer. Different communities, one empire. This tolerance wasn't just enlightened policy, it was smart economics. Jews expelled from Spain in 1492 brought commercial networks and expertise. Greek merchants controlled Black Sea trade. Armenian craftsmen made Istanbul famous for luxury goods. The Ottomans understood something that many empires missed. Diversity was a source of strength, not weakness. The capital, Istanbul, had become the largest city in Europe, with over 600,000 inhabitants. The Topkapi Palace was a city within a city, housing thousands of officials, servants, and the Sultan's family. The Grand Bazaar had 4,000 shops selling goods from around the world. The Süleymaniye Mosque, completed in 1557, was architectural perfection that still moves visitors to tears today. But the real genius of the Ottoman system was its meritocracy. Unlike European kingdoms where nobles inherited power, the Ottoman Empire promoted based on ability. A peasant's son could become Grand Vizier if he had the talent. The Janissary Corps, recruited from Christian boys, often rose to command entire armies. It was social mobility on a scale Europe wouldn't see for centuries. However, golden ages never last forever. and by the late 1600s, cracks were beginning to show. The empire had grown so large that communication took months. Local governors increasingly acted like independent rulers. The Janissaries, once the elite military force, had become a privileged class more interested in protecting their benefits than fighting wars. Most critically, the world was changing around the Ottomans. European powers were developing new military technologies, establishing global trade networks, and creating more efficient administrative systems. The discovery of sea routes to Asia reduced the importance of overland trade that had enriched the empire for centuries. The first major warning came in 1683 at the Second Siege of Vienna. Unlike Suleiman's campaign 150 years earlier, this siege ended in catastrophic defeat. A combined European army not only relieved Vienna, but pursued the Ottoman army all the way to Belgrade. For the first time in centuries, the empire was clearly in retreat. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 marked the end of Ottoman expansion in Europe. It was like watching a champion boxer lose their first fight. Everyone suddenly realized the giant might not be invincible after all.
The 18th century was brutal for the Ottoman Empire. Once the teacher, it had become the student, desperately trying to learn from the same European powers it had once threatened. But here's what's fascinating about this period. It wasn't just a story of decline. It was a story of repeated attempts at reinvention, of an ancient empire trying to modernize while staying true to its identity. Think of the Ottoman Empire in the 1700s like a once dominant tech company that suddenly found itself disrupted by younger, more innovative competitors. The Ottomans still had massive resources, experienced leadership, and loyal customers, but their fundamental business model was being challenged by new technologies and new ways of thinking. The problems were multiplying faster than solutions. The Janissary Corps, once the empire's greatest military asset, had become its greatest liability. These elite soldiers had become a hereditary class more interested in running businesses and collecting benefits than fighting wars. Imagine if your special forces turned into a powerful labor union that could veto any military reform. That's what the Ottomans faced. Meanwhile, European armies were becoming more professional, more disciplined, and much better equipped. The balance of military power that had favored the Ottomans for centuries was shifting dramatically. Wars that the empire had once won easily were now costly stalemates or outright defeats. The economic situation was even worse. European merchants had found sea routes to Asia that bypassed Ottoman territories entirely. The silver flooding in from the Americas caused massive inflation throughout the empire. Traditional crafts industries couldn't compete with European manufactured goods. It was like watching your main revenue streams dry up while your costs kept rising. But some Ottoman leaders saw the writing on the wall and tried to do something about it. Sultan Ahmed III launched what historians call the Tulip period, a time of cultural opening to European ideas. Ottoman ambassadors were sent to European capitals not as conquerors, but as students, learning about new technologies and administrative practices. The most dramatic reform attempt came with Selim III, who ruled from 1789 to 1807. Selim tried to create a new European-style army called the Nizam-i-Jadid, or New Order. He invited European military advisors, established new military schools, and attempted to bypass the Janissaries entirely. It was a bold plan, but it faced the same problem that plagues many reform efforts. Entrenched interests fought back. In 1807, the Janissaries revolted, deposed Selim III, and killed most of the reformers. It seemed like the empire was doomed to decline rather than reform. But then came one of the most dramatic figures in Ottoman history, Mahmud II. Mahmud II understood that half measures wouldn't work. In 1826, he essentially declared war on the Janissaries themselves. When they revolted again, Mahmud was ready. His artillery bombarded their barracks, and in a single bloody day, the Janissary Corps, the military force that had conquered Constantinople and threatened Vienna, was completely destroyed. This event, called the Auspicious Incident, cleared the way for serious modernization. Mahmud established new military schools, created a modern bureaucracy, and began the process of legal reform. But his most symbolic act was changing how people dressed. He banned traditional Ottoman clothing and required government officials to wear European-style uniforms and the fez. It sounds trivial, but imagine telling Americans they couldn't wear baseball caps anymore. Clothing is identity, and Mahmud was trying to create a new Ottoman identity. The reform movement reached its peak during the Tanzimat period, 1839 to 1876, meaning reorganization. Under Sultans Abdul-Majid I and Abdul Aziz, the empire promulgated new laws guaranteeing equality for all citizens regardless of religion, established new schools and hospitals, built railways and telegraph lines, and created a more efficient tax system. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, was both a victory and a wake-up call. The Ottomans, allied with Britain and France, defeated Russia, but only with massive European help. The war showed that Ottoman reforms were working, but also that the empire could no longer stand alone as a great power. By the 1870s, European newspapers were calling the Ottoman Empire the sick man of Europe. But this sick man was actually transforming itself in ways that would have seemed impossible a century earlier. New schools were producing a generation of Ottoman intellectuals who read European philosophy and dreamed of constitutional government. A free press was debating the future of the empire. Women were beginning to appear in public life. The culmination came in 1876 with the promulgation of the Ottoman Constitution, creating a parliament and guaranteeing civil rights. For a brief moment, it seemed like the empire might successfully transform itself into a modern constitutional monarchy. But then came Abdul Hamid II, and everything changed.
Abdul Hamid II, who ruled from 1876 to 1909, is one of history's most controversial and complex rulers. Europeans called him Abdul the Damned, but many Ottomans saw him as the defender of tradition against foreign interference. Understanding Abdul Hamid is key to understanding how the Ottoman Empire met its end. Picture this. You inherit a massive empire that's drowning in debt to European banks, losing territory in every war, and facing nationalist revolts from a dozen different ethnic groups. European powers are literally carving up your empire like a Thanksgiving turkey, taking slices whenever they feel like it. What do? Abdul Hamid's answer was to suspend the constitution, dissolve parliament, and rule as an absolute monarch, while simultaneously trying to modernize the empire on his own terms. He was like a CEO who fires the board of directors and tries to run everything himself. Sometimes this works, usually it doesn't. The irony is that Abdul Hamid was actually a successful modernizer in many ways. He expanded the railway system, telegraph networks, and public education. He established new universities and professional schools. The empire's first medical school for women opened during his reign. But he did all this while maintaining strict censorship and secret police surveillance that would make modern authoritarian regimes proud. Abdul Hamid's greatest fear was that the empire would be completely dismembered by European powers and local nationalisms. His strategy was to emphasize Islamic unity over Ottoman diversity. He styled himself as Caliph of all Muslims, not just Sultan of the Ottomans. It was a gamble that might have worked in a different era, but it alienated many non-Muslim citizens who had been loyal to the empire for centuries. The empire's final act began with the Young Turk Revolution of 1908. A group of military officers and intellectuals calling themselves the Committee of Union and Progress, forced Abdulhamid to restore the constitution and recall parliament. They promised to save the empire through modernization and constitutional government. The Young Turks were like startup founders who had big dreams but little experience. They talked about Ottomanism, creating a common Ottoman identity that would unite all the empire's peoples. But when this failed to stop nationalist revolts and territorial losses, they shifted toward Turkish nationalism, which only made things worse. Then came the disaster that ended everything, World War I. In 1914, the Ottoman Empire faced an impossible choice. Staying neutral meant watching the war reshape the world without any influence over the outcome, but joining either side was enormously risky. The Young Turk leaders, led by Enver Pasha, made what historians consider one of the worst strategic decisions in history. They allied with Germany. The war was catastrophic for the Ottomans. They faced enemies on multiple fronts: Russians in the east, British in the south, and eventually Greeks and Italians in the west. The empire's economy collapsed under the strain of total war. Ethnic tensions, suppressed for centuries, exploded into violence, including the tragic Armenian genocide of 1915 to 1917. By 1918, the empire was completely exhausted. When Germany surrendered, the Ottoman Empire had no choice but to surrender as well. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 was designed to eliminate the Ottoman Empire entirely, partitioning its remaining territory among the victorious powers. But the story doesn't end there. From the ashes of the Ottoman Empire emerged one of the 20th century's most remarkable leaders, Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk. He led a nationalist resistance that successfully expelled foreign occupiers and established the modern Republic of Turkey in 1923. On November 1, 1922, the Grand National Assembly of Turkey formally abolished the Ottoman Sultanate. Mehmed VI, the last Ottoman Sultan, fled Istanbul on a British warship. After 623 years, the Ottoman Empire was no more.
So, what do we make of this incredible story? How do we judge an empire that lasted over 6 centuries, controlled 3 continents, and shaped the course of world history? The Ottoman Empire's legacy is complex and often contradictory. It was an empire built by conquest that became famous for tolerance. It created one of history's most successful systems for managing diversity, yet it ended with ethnic conflict and tragedy. It was both deeply traditional and remarkably innovative, both Asian and European, both Muslim and surprisingly secular in its governance. Today, you can see Ottoman influence everywhere, in the coffee culture that spread from Istanbul to Vienna, in architectural styles from Budapest to Cairo, in the administrative systems of modern Turkey and the Balkans, even in the surnames of millions of people across 3 continents. Perhaps most importantly, the Ottoman Empire proved that different peoples, religions, and cultures could coexist and even thrive together, a lesson our world desperately needs to remember. It wasn't perfect, and it made terrible mistakes, especially in its final decades. But for centuries, it offered an alternative model of empire based on integration rather than elimination, adaptation rather than rigid ideology. The Ottoman story reminds us that no empire lasts forever, but the best of them leave behind something valuable: institutions, ideas, and examples that future generations can learn from and build upon. From a small tribe with a dream to a world empire, and finally to a modern nation-state, the Ottoman story is ultimately a human story, a reminder of both our capacity for greatness and our need for constant renewal and adaptation. That's the complete history of the Ottoman Empire. Thanks for joining me on this incredible journey through 6 centuries of triumph, tragedy, and transformation. If you enjoyed this epic tale,
Make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the empires that shaped our world.